Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final session of Day 1 RevEx Fest Revenue Excellent Festival for Modern Sales Pros. For those of you who are just tuning in, welcome. And for those of you who stuck with us throughout the day, welcome back. I'm going to say a few words about the team at Modern Sales Pros before we begin. So, if you're not familiar with MSP, Modern Sales Pros is the world's largest and highest quality community for those in sales management, sales leadership, sales revenue operations, and enablement, aka our Modern Sales Pros. Our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer the toughest revenue questions out there. So, if you're not a member yet, you'll be invited to join right after Summit. And I want to say a few words about our amazing sponsors. RevEx Fest wouldn't have been made possible without all these sponsors that you see here. So big kudos to them for making RevEx happen. And definitely check out the sponsor tab located at the top, along with the agenda tab. We have a full list of speakers and panels all throughout the week, so definitely check out our agenda for the next 2 days. Now I'm going to go through the agenda of what to expect for the session. I'm going to say some few housekeeping notes, and then I'm going to pass it off to our final fireside chat of the day to do some introductions and then dive right into the discussion prompts. So first and foremost, familiarize yourself with Goldcast. Definitely check out the Q&A tab function at the right-hand corner. Ask your questions there or the chat. Definitely add in where you're calling in from, what city, state, or country. And also don't forget to check out the agenda and sponsor tab at the top right-hand corner. Now on to our last fireside chat of the day, enabling the world sales management, enablement, and leadership with the founder of Hightspot. I'm going to pass it off to Pete Kazanji to introduce himself and introduce our awesome guest of this evening. Pete, take it away.
Right, killer. Thanks, Angelica. Hi, Robert. How are you?
Hi, Pete. I'm good. How are you?
Excellent. I am super pumped for our conversation today. I have been a longtime fan of what Hightspot has been doing in the industry, and I'm really pumped to kind of like talk about a little bit of the history, kind of the like how enablement has changed over time, kind of where things are going in the future. Should be pretty fun. Why don't you take a quick second to maybe give our audience a little bit of context on, how long you've been working at Hightspot, what you did before, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get into like kind of the founding story of Hightspot afterwards, but just like so people kind of understand where you're coming from.
Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Wabi. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Hightspot. Actually, Hightspot's about 10 years old now, so we've been doing this for a bit. Before that, spent a long time at Microsoft, and before that, lived in the Valley, went to Berkeley, and did a startup because everyone in the 90s did a startup, and I
Obviously
got acquired by Microsoft. And the goal was to spend a couple of years and learn from the giant. Back then, Microsoft was everywhere in the late 90s. Ended up staying there quite a few years, mostly in engineering. So I'm an engineer by trade. But then the last 3 years actually was the CMO under Satya for the server tools division there. And that's where the need for a solution like Hightspot and the itch for kind of doing something like Hightspot came from, is really seeing what happens with marketing and sales enablement at scale, and the idea that maybe technology could help. And so that was the thing we jumped to go do, and here we are 10 years later, and we're still doing that, and it's still dynamic and it's still changing all the time.
I thought you just used SharePoint for it. Isn't that the Microsoft?
It was only that easy.
Right, exactly. Oh my gosh.
SharePoint was, we had an incredible SharePoint at Microsoft, as you can imagine. I'm not revealing anything that's confidential. 200,000 pieces of content on it.
Holy mackerel.
And I used to travel a lot throughout the world asking people what they needed. And they told me that that particular SharePoint site was the very first place they went, never to find what they were looking for.
I love it. I love it. Wonderful. Well, for folks who might not be familiar with me, my name is Pete Kazanji. I am the founder of Atrium. For folks who are not familiar, Atrium makes data-driven sales management software that helps managers, leaders, and reps use metrics to improve performance. Prior to starting Atrium, started Atrium in 2016. Started a previous software company called Talentbin that was acquired by Monster Worldwide in 2014. It was it was a recruiting software company, and that's really where I went from being like a business generalist founder to our first sales rep, our first sales manager, our sales leader, and then which is kind of how I got on this sales management, modern sales journey. Subsequent to the acquisition, I wrote a book on startup sales called Founding Sales, and then also started Modern Sales Pros, which you all are familiar with. So that's a little bit about me. And actually, fun story for you. After I got acquired by Talentbin, got acquired by Monster Worldwide, Monster used the SharePoint, and I, as the person who was responsible for new product sales, I was, responsible for enablement. Like I have a background in product marketing, so curating the assets, et cetera. And so I actually had an old, because I used to work at VMware a long time ago. I had an old Microsoft Windows 7 VM that I would use to edit the SharePoint site because I had a Mac. And just because the editing experience in Internet Explorer was so much more compelling than it was on in Chrome. So that's a fun fact. So we shared that.
Another fun fact is Monster no longer uses SharePoint.
Wow.
They've moved on to a modern sales enablement platform. That's all I'm saying. It's a modern sales enablement platform.
Rhymes with starts with hi, ends with spot.
Exactly.
That's amazing. Wow, that's a great account. Good job. Wonderful. So I thought maybe what we could start with here is maybe just share a little bit more deeply on how you started Hightspot, because geez, I didn't realize that the company had been around for 10 years, which I mean, time flies when you're having fun, right? But maybe you could share a little bit about what inspired Hightspot and how you started it.
Yeah, so originally, we really were trying to understand how could we get product marketing and sales to work effectively together. And we thought the main problem, which turned out to be one of the problems, but we thought the main problem was, how can I take all that content that's being produced and all the campaigns associated with that content and get it in the hands of sales such that they would use it? Because that's what I saw. When I would land in a country and talk to the senior leadership, and I would say, what do you need? They'd say, I would need A, I need B, I need C. And inevitably, I'd already delivered A, B, and C. I'd put it on the portal. I had sent an email. I had done internal webinars. I had done everything I could to get that content in their hands. And yet they weren't using it. And the conversations they were having were based on old positioning, old messaging, things that they had done. So the question was, could we find a way to make it easy to build really great experiences, search, browsing, targeting inside of CRM, that make people be able to find content. And so the problem was a content management problem that we tried to solve. And we've done that. We have lots and lots of customers that have 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, hundreds of thousands of pieces of content.
Wow.
Well organized, well governed, easy to find, all of those things. But it turned out that was only the beginning of the journey. So the next thing that we realized is that it turns out if you are a rep and I say, I have this wonderful bevy of content, I have 50,000 pieces of content,
go search
you can find it at a moment's notice, you're like, great, but when am I supposed to use this thing? You have 100 case studies, maybe in a big company, 1,000 case studies. I'm supposed to use them early in the deal, late in the deal. How should I use them by industry? And so we started investing in plays, which is basically when and how to use the content. And it turns out if you put things in the context of what salespeople actually do, which is engage with customers, you get this incredible uplift in usage, like 40, 50% more usage, more engagement, more sharing of the content with the prospect. That was the next part of the journey. But it turns out when you step all the way back and you ask the question, what is enablement trying to do? Well, what we're trying to do is help drive sales productivity. And there's lots of tools, and you're talking to some of these folks at your conference about being really efficient on creating activity. And Atrium, yourself, and others are really good about insights into those activities and insights into those outcomes. We're complementary to both of those. Our job is, are you having the right conversation when you get them on the phone? And how does that manifest itself in terms of pipeline, conversion, win rates, all of those kinds of things? So our job is to drive productivity by hopefully getting people to do something different tomorrow than they do today, so they're better at their jobs. So that's what enablement does for a living. And it turns out if I
change behavior, right?
change
Like
behavior,
it
do something different.
change behavior, because like, yeah, like seeing a shortfall, right, or a defect or an improvement area, like that's just the beginning. Right?
Totally.
Like you gotta, like, you can't just who was it? You can't admire a problem, right? you gotta fix
You
it.
gotta do something about it.
And in our case, like the problems are resident in like rep behavior, so you got to change that behavior.
Yeah, and if you think about what insight tools do, is they're very good about detecting either activity issues or outcome issues. But then the very next click is, well, do I have a skill problem or a will problem? If my activities are all low, I might have a will problem. In other words, they're not doing the job. But if all the activities are right, I might have a skill problem. And that's where Hightspot comes in. So after we did content and plays, what we call guidance, because there's lots of ways to do guided selling, plays, targeting inside of CRM, all sorts of ways to kind of do guidance. You then ask yourself, if I were in a classroom setting, or if I was on a sports team, and I told you, hey, I'm going to make you much better I'm going to improve your sports team, and here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to give you the right resources and the right plays and do nothing more. You'd be like, well, that's not going to work. Me reading the plays and me reading the content is not going to make me better at my job. So that's where we had to get into the job of training and practice. In some cases, I need to actually have you take a course,
repetitions,
be all certified, and I need you to practice before you get onto the field. I'm trying to make you better. So that's where training and practice come in. And then it turns out if you stop there, you're really not done, because the manager needs to know, okay, if the whole goal was you're going to be better at the conversation, what's happening in the conversation. So that's where you need to coach and say, hey, I'm trying to do better at discovery. I gave you the right content. I gave you the right plays. I trained, we practiced, and we did role playing. Now as the frontline manager, reviewing that engagement, seeing if the discovery is better, and then hopefully that results in better activity and better outcomes in these other tools.
Yeah,
so that's what enablement does.
Which is like the closed loop, right? Like detect the issue. I think the phrase that I've stolen from you is like prescribe the get well plan. Ensure that the get well plan has been like, consumed and actually executed on, and then was it the right get well plan? Because that's the big problem. I'm a big fan of OODA loops. So like, observe, orient, decide, act, and then like loop back, right? And so you got to loop back, right? Because you can't just tell yourself a story like, all right, cool. Like I had this hypothesis, and because I'm so smart and handsome, obviously it's been, obviously it was correct. Like, no, you got to validate, like, okay, cool. They had a win rate issue coming out of proposal. We then we then prescribe some solutions associated with that. Maybe had something to do with like maybe a course in the LMS, maybe maybe it was associated with some playbooks or whatever. Did that win rate out of proposal then remediate? Did that actually close?
There's really a few things. One is you want to coach, which is not really about closing the loop yet, but it's making sure that things are landing as you'd expect. And then there's actually closing the loop, which is let me see the analytics change. There's lagging indications and there's leading indications, but let me see if they change. And then if in there's kind of two things. One is like what you're talking about. I'm the frontline manager. I'm working with Joe and Jane, but there's also the enablement perspective, which is, hey, I'm working with 1,000 people. What trends am I seeing?
Sure.
And this is where I think operations, sales ops, and enablement really need to be joined at the hip. Because often what happens is, when you look at, let's take something like win rate.
Sure.
You know what your win rate is by geography, by department, by segment, you name it, everybody knows that information. But what often sales operations teams don't do is look at it by participation by the reps. So it might be the case that your average win rate is what you want. Let's say you want 40%, you got 40%. But that could be because everyone's
killer win rate
really well. Or it could be the case that the top quartile is killing it and has 60%, and everybody else is like at 20 or 30. And so you need to know what kind of execution problem you have to know what the get well plan is. And that is really closing the loop, which is look at all the metrics you care about in tools like yours and in other tools. figure out what the participation is of those metrics
Yeah.
broadly, figure out what kind of problem you have, figure out what the enablement solution is, equip, train, coach against that get well plan, and hopefully the metrics change for the better. But that's the loop. That's the forever loop of getting better and better and driving a consistent revenue engine.
Yeah, which I think is historic. Like when we've talked to enablement leaders or like CROs, and they, people are now starting to kind of wrap their minds around this notion of like what we like to refer to as data-driven sales management, where you like it is incumbent on you as a leader, incumbent on you as a sales operations leader, enablement leader, to equip your managers to manage by metric, because that's the way you're going to get them leverage. That's like a newer concept, and it makes sense because the ability to like the data that you're instrumenting has only been around for like 5 or 10 years. So like these muscles the muscles are like newly being built. The historical way of doing this is saying like, hey, we're going to have a big initiative across the team. Like this quarter, we're going to focus on, AE self prospecting or whatever. But you might have like 50% of the organization like doesn't have that problem, right? And so like now what you're doing is you're putting your sales training resources against something that only like lands for 50% of your folks, versus identifying on a like what you're kind of talking about on a team by team basis, what is like the high order metric that like needs the most, the most glowing up, and then kind of working at that accordingly.
And it's
I
an
actually
and,
want
by
to,
the way, the way you said it's
yeah,
an and, because sometimes you want to be at the individual level or the team level. And sometimes your strategic initiative is we're rolling out a new
sure.
sales methodology. I don't want to do it by team. I want to be like, this is how we're going to equip, train, coach.
That's a change management thing.
Yeah. And so much of but so many of the hypotheses are change management problems, right? So,
Sure.
I'm having a problem converting stage 1 to stage 2. I think it's a discovery problem. Identify that it's a broad discovery problem. I need to go do equip, train, coach against that problem. Make sure you coach, look at the analytics, make sure that they change, and then go back to what I talked about. You want to look for watermelons, which is, metrics that are on average green, but when you when you double click on them, it's such that their average is green, but inside they're red because you don't have consistent execution. You have one cohort doing great and the rest of the cohort struggling. That is the most common thing we see in analytics for sales.
I love the watermelon example. One thing that I think the same way that sales operations is changing, or like RevOps now is changing, because it used to be viewed as very, very like internal service orientated, or like an internal vendor. Like, yeah, they do the comp, they do territory management, they they do validation rules, all that sort of jazz. Now transitioning to being, either more of a partner, like maybe less of the tail, more of the dog, kind of like wagging the organization. I think enablement is in a similar situation where, historically was viewed as like sales training.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we're here to train you. Right. This is how we're going to, validate your, we're going to disco certify you.
Yeah.
We're going to pitch certify you. We're going to do it during onboarding, et cetera, et cetera. And that's like oftentimes very one and done, and also, not data driven necessarily, maybe not like strategic. Maybe you can talk about like some of the transition that you've seen from sales training, like 10 years ago to like, modern enablement organizations.
Yeah, so I would say there's a few things going on. So enablement definitely has to do what I will call foundational programs.
Sure.
Hi, Pete, you're hired. I got to onboard you.
Onboarding. Yeah.
Hey,
onboarding.
For every industry, we sell products and services. They get changed, they get improved. And every quarter, I need to tell you about all the new stuff, and I might need to certify you and all that stuff. So there's ongoing training, and onboarding is real, and you have to do it. And it's an and, not an or.
Yep.
Then there are strategic initiatives that you want to do, hopefully data-driven, or change management because you're doing something new. Hey, I bought a company and I'm trying to get good at cross-sell.
New sales methodology.
I looked at my analytics and I see that I have a problem systemically. I've looked for the watermelons. I see I have a problem, and I want to go do a strategic initiative to change that. So at the end of the day, independent of the foundational programs, our job is to take the CRO and the CMO and the CEO's dream. The dream is, let's just take a dream. I bought another company. And I think I'm going to get great cross-sell between company product A and product B. That's my dream. And then I have 9,000 reps around the world. How do I make my dream a reality? What's the bridge between I have a dream and what the person does in Brazil? And that's enablement. So you better equip and train and coach them and use the analytics to understand if I can get my dream to be a reality. Most CMOs and CROs know or have hypotheses about how to make their business more effective, scale more efficiently, all of those things. The challenge is not having the dream. The challenge is landing the dream with your 100,000, 10,000,
blocking and tackling,
reps, depending on how big you are. And
Right.
that's the bridge enablement has, and it's very strategic. That said, enablement and ops have to be together, because you mentioned all the things that ops does. In a lot of companies that we work with, ops is also the keeper of the analytics.
Yeah.
And the problem is, and you and I have talked about this, they're very good at funnel analytics. Most organizations are really good at that. They're not good at people analytics, which goes back to this watermelon, which is, don't give me the average win rate, the average pipeline, the average conversion. Tell me what my participation is. Ops does use participation almost universally in one metric, quota attainment.
Yep.
They say, hey, 50 on 100 or 70 on 70. That concept is very well entrenched in sales ops. But what about all the other metrics that matter? Pipeline, conversion, win rate. You want to know participation in there. And the reason board members want to know participation rate is because they know that averages hide a bunch of problems.
Yeah.
Well, why doesn't it hide a bunch of problems in all the other metrics? Well, it does. And so that is a data-driven way that ops can say, you know what, we're helping the team. We've identified low participation in, let's just call it win rate. We need a get well plan. And then based on what the details are of the participation rate, you might have a strategy problem, like no one can get the number, or you might have a cohort that's doing great and a cohort that's not doing great. And then you have an enablement problem. And in an ideal world, ops turns to enablement and says, hey, this is you now, go fix it. And I don't think
look what I found. I found a present for you. Yeah, exactly. And I think we see this all the time too, because here at Atrium we make what we call data-driven sales management software. We call analytics the A word, because we're trying to we're trying to create conceptual space between them, because when you use metrics to understand, measure and manage and improve individuals, are squishy. Right. And whereas analytics has historically been the realm of finance, or when operations is talking about these things, it's it's bookings, it's it's pipe, it's it's ARR, it's NRR, it's things like that. And oftentimes these things have to be very precise, even though I don't know, bookings oftentimes ends up not being very precise too, because debooking things and all sorts of fun. But anyway, people want to tell themselves a story that it's very precise, whereas the level of precision that you need around instrumenting reps or whatever, because reps are squishy, often ends up being a lot less. And it's more about making sure that you have coverage across all the different kind of parts of the sales motion as a rep, versus just being having high precision over a small set of metrics that maybe won't reveal what a potential issue is. The other thing too is that God bless our brethren in operations, which I kind of count myself as one. I'm a sales operations person, faking being a sales leader, because I'm a pretty left brain guy. I think the thing we have to realize is that helping the maybe the more right brained folks in the organization, whether that's sales managers, sales enablement, very empathetic, communicative storytellers, et cetera, parse these metrics and is a really important thing. And so I think there's kind of two things I'd like you to get your perspective on. One, how that partnership can be better, and then secondarily, anytime you have a partnership kind of situation, it's a two-legged race, right? And a three-legged race, and that can be tough. How can enablement build that muscle themselves? Because this is something, this is the drum that we beat all the time, which is hey, sales managers and leaders have to use metrics to measure and improve their team. The same is true with enablement people, even though we maybe haven't been math people in the past. So how are those two things kind of shaping up in your customer bases?
I would say there's two kinds of analytics. So one is within their function. So ops within their function, so funnel metrics in their function. And then for enablement, there's lots of activity and outcomes within enablement. How well governed is your
Sure.
content? How up to date are your plans? How much training has been taken and what is the passing course? Have the practices been done? Are the managers actually inspecting the calls and maybe giving feedback on those calls? Those are activities and outcomes within enablement, within
enablement. Yep.
But that's not the magic. Those are important, by the way. We that's our bread and butter. We love it.
Yep.
But the magic happens when ops and enablement work together.
Yeah.
And the key is that you need, for every metric that ops cares about, whether it's narrow or broad, put a people dimension on it, which is nothing more, and we can get into much more detail, but it's nothing more than take all of your intuition about participation rates of quota and apply it to every metric that you care about. And the reason that matters is that will identify inconsistent execution, which is opportunities to make your revenue engine consistent, which is an enablement problem. And then enablement needs to say, hey, I need participation rates on all the key metrics. So enablement needs to ask for it, and ops needs to go build it. Now, it turns out when you go to an ops team, which is great at the funnel, and you're like, hey, no problem, just give me a histogram on every metric with all the same dimensionality. I want the histogram of win rate by geo, by segment, by product line. They're like, whoa, that's a whole new table. That's a whole new infrastructure. And you're like, yes, but that's how you drive consistent revenue, is you need consistent execution. And the way you measure consistency is very simple. It's participation. And we can get into all the details of that. So basically, enablement needs to ask for it, ops needs to offer it, and that will help them identify and closed loop fix execution problems at scale.
Yeah. I think, so you guys work with a lot of organizations that have, you know, like well accoutered sales enablement functions that have, like what you're describing right now is like kind of a Ferrari situation, which is just rad, right? But I think another thing there is if sales enablement, if you don't have all those humans, right, to kind of execute on those things, how can enablement, how can other people in the organization do some of these same things? Like, I'll give you an example. We have a pretty scaled customer that has, like, you know, whatever it is, like 120 SDRs or what have you, and they have these enablement specialists that work with like one enablement specialist is tied to like 8 SDR managers. And it's essentially like the unbundling of like a management behavior, which is like coaching and what have you. And there's also like a train the trainer situation there too. But like we see this because they're enablement specialists. They have like 5 of them or whatever. Like their activity levels in Atrium are just like bananas. They're just like off the charts, right? But if you don't have that situation, and instead what you have is like 3 SDR managers or 4 SDR managers, how can you make it such that those folks are like doing a good job of like enabling their staff, even if they don't have like an enablement person to help them?
So then you're just going to be more, a little bit less data driven and more have hypotheses about what's going right and what's going wrong. In other words, I think if you're going to do enablement, as opposed to random acts of enablement, you have to ask yourself the following question. Okay, what problem am I trying to solve? This is going to sound simple, but this is really a discipline that a lot of organizations actually don't have. What problem am I trying to solve? What business outcome do I think will actually be impacted by doing some work? You know, again, conversion, pipeline, you name it. Then specifically, what do I want my reps to do differently tomorrow than today to change that business outcome? And then you can ask the question, what am I going to do to equip, train, and coach them? So as long as you have a hypothesis which says, maybe not completely data-driven with all sorts of fancy reports and participation rates, but you're like, hey, the problem I'm trying to solve is, I think we can win more against this competitor, and here's how I think we can do it. We need to be better at objection handling in this way. And I think I'm going to get my win rate to be 5 points over the next next 3 months or next 6 months, depending on your sales cycle. And in the meantime, my leading indicator is going to be more stage conversion. Right. And to do that, here's what I have to go do. And then I figure out what content I need, what plays I need, et cetera, et cetera. I think that is a fine way to do it as well. You're just not going to be all fancy data driven with all these participation rates and everything else. But at the end of the day, what the sales leader needs to be doing, in my mind, is coming up with their dreams implementing their dreams, understanding the analytics of those dreams, and then rinse and repeat.
Right.
That is the job. And you can either be fancy and data driven with ops and enablement working together, or you can just have intuition about what's going right and what's going wrong. Because often it's the case that if you listen to 20 calls, you're like, oh my gosh.
You get a pattern pretty quick.
You get a pattern.
You get a pattern.
It's just hard to do when you get to, we have customers with 100,000 reps. It just gets hard to do at scale.
That's so
You're like, well, I'm going to listen to my 10 calls for my 100,000 reps and come up with a pattern.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll be listening to the calls until the end of the universe. So I think that actually kind of leads me to another thing, that one of the things that we talk about quite a bit with our customers is like enabling, like sales enablement, especially like, data-driven sales enablement, or as we kind of like to say, data-driven sales management, is a newer thing. And the one of the challenges is that if you have like an enablement resource or a handful of enablement resources, you're probably going to deploy those against reps first, right? Like you were saying, your foundational programs, got to get onboarding, got to have new hire, university, got to have like, work with product marketing for when they ship new things, got to get it deployed to the field, et cetera, et cetera. The thing that oftentimes gets missed that we've seen, and I'm glad that this, like, as the kids say, this vibe is shifting right now, because there's been like way more writing on like manager enablement and like making managers more effective. But managers have historically kind of been like left out in the cold there. There hasn't been as much like train the trainer situation, how to have good one-on-ones, how to deliver, candid feedback. I mean, we've seen this in our customer base so much that like we have Richard Harris, a sales trainer. We literally have him monthly do half-day boot camps, one on sales management and one on sales leadership. And it has nothing to do with like data-driven stuff. Like, it's like our CSMs can handle that stuff. It's more about like how to have an effective one-on-one, how to deliver like, critical feedback and so on and so forth. So, what have you seen in your customers around like how they can make their managers more effective? Because like managers got 6, 8, 10 reps under them. If you can get, like, it's a huge source of leverage if only you can get them to do the behaviors that like, your enablement people are good at.
So I think it is a trend that's changing, which is fantastic. I think frontline managers are absolutely critical. In fact, if you don't enable your frontline managers in the right ways, you probably are not going to be successful. Maybe you can be, but it's very hard. So I would say a couple of things. One is, if you look at our best practices around strategic enablement, we talk about, as you equip, train, coach, you're constantly asking yourself, what am I going to do for the frontline managers? What am I going to do for the reps? And often
just
the
like two personas. Just have it in, like, have it in the plan. Have it in the plan.
If you have the resources, often you have different enablement people for managers versus the reps, by AE, AM, SDR, ADR, all those different roles. And you're typically doing the managers ahead of the reps. That's part one. So they're getting the same training, but they're getting ahead of it. And then they have an extra piece, which is, okay, here's what I want you to do as the manager to help reinforce it for the rep. So we talk about sales plays. In our system, people often use our play system as not only sales plays, but as coaching plays. Coaching plays say, hey, we're going to land this thing, and here's what I want you to do. One is, I want you to do role playing with your reps. I like you to do 3 of those. And then I want you to listen to 3 calls, and I want you to give them feedback. And that's the coaching play. And by the way, here are the 5 things that you're going to see in general. And here's the get well plan for each of those, which might be going back to equip, train, coach. So in other words, it's all very circular, but the point is, you're telling your managers not only the information that the reps are getting, of course, but you're telling them also how to help reinforce it. And I would say the most common mistake for enablement is not to do the coach part of equip, train, coach.
Oh, totally.
I mean, I think in the old days, they did equip without the train. That's less true now. I think people realize that I need to kind of reinforce that through training, especially in regulated industries. And practice. Coaching is critical. And so this notion of a coaching play being associated with a sales play is now much more common in our base, at least, because we have.
So you guys just like used, did your customer success team just like start doing that? Like, hey,
actually our customers started doing that, and we're like, wow, that is super interesting.
I love that. Isn't that, God, I was just like, yeah, that's so fantastic that this is why, like, yeah, you got to listen to your customer success team and sees the like the cool like desire paths that
Totally.
customers do with your stuff, because like they'll do wacky stuff. Like, oh man, we just had this the other day. One of our big customers, like their head of enablement told me this and it blew my mind. She's like, oh yeah, we're using Atrium, because like the common use case for Atrium is like help the frontline manager, SDR manager, AE managers,
Totally.
et cetera, like use data to manage their reps. Like, okay, cool. How many meetings do you have last week? Do you have enough ops, right? Like, what's your pipe hygiene look like, et cetera. And she's like, oh yeah. Well, one of the things that we've been doing is we've been using Atrium to evaluate new tools. I was like, what are you talking about? She's like, oh yeah. Well, we run these pilots, like, we had an auto dialer thing the other day where we ran a pilot on it. And we just, essentially like we looked at the tool, or sorry, we looked at the metrics to see if like the outcome was there. Like, cool, like, yeah, it ramped our call rate and ramped our call numbers, et cetera. And like our connect rates, obviously took a huge nosedive or whatever. But like, this amount of opportunity creation came out and this much pipeline. And so we bought the tool and I was like, oh my gosh, you guys should use Atrium to like, buy another tool. That's great. And like, we'd never like heard that use case before. We're like, wow, customers, they'll figure out like cool stuff to do with your stuff there. Okay.
And that
So
works
that's
great
where like
depending
the
on your
coaching
sales
plays
cycle.
came from.
And that works great depending on your sales cycle.
Got it. So the coaching thing is like a big. Oh, why do you think that people have historically been resistant to that? I have some theories, but I'd love your take on like why that's been like the missing piece.
I think people don't remember what it's like to learn. And it turns out, if I told you, again, I like to go back to the sports analogy because we all probably did sports as a kid, at least some level.
That's
we've watched sports, at least even if tangentially. So it's fairly universal. And if you think about a sports team, again, if all I did for you was give you all the plays and I gave you all the training at training camp, and I never gave you any feedback on what you were actually doing and practicing, it would be crazy. And I think people forget that. And that role is not enablement, and it's not ops, and it's not that poor CRO either. The only function that can scale at a big team is a frontline manager, because they have 6 to 8 reports, whatever it may be, and they can actually coach if they've been asked to coach, and this is the crazy thing, enabled to coach. Because often, who are the frontline managers? They're our best sellers, got promoted.
Yeah, they've been promoted. Yeah.
And so we need to teach them like, hey, you need to coach in these following ways. And here's what it means to be a good coach. That I think is now, on people's minds. I don't think it was 5 years ago, and definitely wasn't 10 years ago.
Yeah, and also I think that hypothesis is a really good one. It's like how long ago was it? Like, I'm 42, I think. And like how long ago was it that like, I mean, the last time I did any sort of like organized athletics was like, when I was on the ultimate frisbee team and the ski team at Stanford, right? And that was the last time I was being coached like proactively. And so I think people like, it kind of falls out of their brain a little bit around like, oh, I'm being micromanaged right now. No, you're being coached, right? Like it's okay, right? That's how especially when there's like a new thing. And I think people also like, it's uncomfortable not being good at something. Like we have, because we're like a small startup, so we don't have a fancy modern enablement platform, and so like a bunch of our onboarding stuff is just like lists of things to do in Asana with like a hyperlink to a course call, and then like the closing the loop is record 10 of these pitches using Cloud App, right? It's like a screen recorder or whatever. And so the funny thing is like I had a couple reps who were like, they were procrastinating, like, oh, it's not good. And I'm just like, just do it. Just do 5 of them. They're like, wow, yeah, the 10th one was way better than the first one. I was like, that's so weird.
It's so weird.
Who would have ever thought that like, as you grooved your brain, it like got better and better. And so, yeah, I think that like, if you can just systematize that in your organization and like make it part of the culture, then you'll have like people who won't be clenching to either give the feedback or like look dumb to start. It's like, yeah, of course you look dumb to start. Like you're trying a new dance move. Like, of course you're going to be terrible until you do it 50 times.
Yeah. Have you heard of the 10-20-70 rule?
No, please. I would love to hear about this.
The 10-20-70 rule, again, going back to like when we all were going through school. So 10% of how you learn is through formal education. So just think about going to high school, going to college, doing all that. The 20% is practice. And so that would be like an internship. So you do your internships during college. Let's say you do a couple of internships. So that's the 10 and the 20. And it's important. It's not, you can't get rid of it, but it's only 30%, but it provides the foundation. And then we all know when we have these wonderful people coming out of college, after all that wonderful 4 years of education and all those internships, on day one, they know nothing.
Yeah.
And that's when the real learning begins on that foundation.
This is how you send a calendar invite.
But on that foundation they have, which is fantastic. But 70% is on the job learning. It's trying it, it's practicing, it's trying it over and over again. That's how we learn. We learn 70%, and these are kind of based on studies that people have done on the job. And that's why this notion of practice and this notion of coaching and closing the loop is so important, because so much of the learning is happening when you're trying to do it, not when you're
and if you have a culture that's like afraid of doing that, then you're literally, that 70 is not happening.
Yeah.
Right. Like
the 10,000 hours thing is real.
Yeah. Like one of the things that, like, we have a couple of different ways that we like scale coaching in this regard. And part of it is just like making sure that managers and leaders are like in the flow of like work production. Right. So a good example of that is like, we don't have that many sales. We have 15 sellers at this point. But we actually created this email listserv that we call sales engineering. It's like probably poorly named. But what happens is that our more tenured sellers BCC it on customer facing comms, and the noobs are subscribed to it. And so what they do is they're just like, so both the noobs and also leaders or managers are subscribed to it. And so what they do is they're just essentially like sampling. They're like sampling the flow of work. And so not only the noobs are seeing it, but also the managers are. And so like, do the managers read like every single email? Like, oh, of course not, right? But they sample it, and when they see that there's a either a good thing, forward it to the full AE team. It's like, hey, look at this badass follow-up email right here, like this amazing objection handle here. See how Bobby's using these 3 assets that they found in Hightspot right here. Like, this is exactly how you should be going about this. And then conversely, like, hey, saw this thing right here. You see maybe the formatting needs to be cleaned up a little bit here. Hey, probably the thing to have included here would be XYZ. So the more that you can be like in the flow of that work production, the quicker you can make those coaching corrections.
You bring that back into the plays that help people understand what good looks like and what the non-good looks like, so that they can actually learn that beforehand as well. So you want to do it in the flow completely, and you want that as much as you can codified inside of your enablement platform. And then you want to mix and match. So for example, if you're in a system and I search for the right document to share with the customer, wouldn't it be great? And of course, this is something that Hightspot can do is, hey, next to that document, it says, here's the 1-minute training you might want to take on this, 1-minute video of what good looks like. Here's the plays that you might want to be running, et cetera, et cetera. So that's in the flow of that learning, in that 70, not in the 10 and the 20.
Yeah. Changing gears a little bit here, because I know we've been talking about enablement, like modern enablement, how to make managers better, how to create a coaching culture. A lot of the people who are sales leaders, and founders and what have you, revenue leaders at in Modern Sales Pros, are in the business of creating new categories of software and like identifying problems that are unsolved or like really unsatisfactorily solved without like a specifically purpose designed solution in question. Hightspot is definitely that. Like this concept of a sales enablement platform, or whatever the appropriate terminology is, sure as heck didn't exist 10 years ago, let alone like certainly wasn't popularized 5 years ago. And so like, what has been kind of like the hardest part of creating that category, and how have you guys been able to tackle that?
Yeah, in our category, I've thought about category creation in many of my roles over the many years, and it's really hard to go do. And to have category creation, it's push and pull. You can't just push a category into the world. It has to be you, and there better be some competitors most likely, and there needs to be a pull on the other side. Enablement is this really interesting category because it is the oldest new category in the world. We've been talking about enablement, putting up, paper brochures in racks, forever. Mm-hmm. So but modern enablement, enabled by technology like the cloud, like mobile, like AI at scale, that is obviously kind of a new category. And the notion that you could use technology to help enablement, that it implied equip, train, and coach in a unified way, that's all relatively new. Yep. And the hardest thing has been what I think marketing automation faced, HubSpot and Marketo faced, a decade ago, and Salesforce and others faced a decade before that,
Mhm.
which is getting the world to understand the profession.
Mm.
It's not the technology, it's the profession. So
Yeah.
when I'm a CRO or a CMO or a CEO and I think enablement, right now I probably think to the old thing, which is training.
Trading.
I
Yeah.
don't think it's my strategic lever to drive sales productivity. It's
Mhm.
my lever to take the dream I have about improving the execution of my team and making it a reality. And so getting them to understand that, number one, and then number two, for the enablement professionals themselves,
Mhm.
being disciplined in how they execute. In the same way that we've had a lot of experience over the last 20 years on how to implement CRM effectively, how to do marketing
Right.
automation effectively. This notion I said about, when you do enablement, think about an initiative. What's the call to action specifically? What's the business outcome? What are the activities you're going to measure early on to understand if it's happening? And then what are you going to do to equip, train, coach? Being that disciplined is relatively new. And so we need to help
Yeah.
elevate the profession. And we actually, we sponsor Sales Enablement Pro, which is not about Hightspot. It's really about the profession. It has
Right.
almost 30,000 members now. And it's all about teaching each other, because it's all about best practices from leaders in the industry. What are
Yeah.
the best practices that we as the industry need to have as a category,
Yeah.
which helps mature the category and helps leadership in these various companies understand how to use the category. They know what sales ops is now. They
Yeah.
need to learn what sales enablement is and how it all relates. So it's really been more about the profession and the maturing of the profession than it is about, let's teach you about, how to build a play. It's not about the technology. That's not the hard part, because the technology is pretty straightforward. It's in terms of ease of use. It's really about what should I go do to make sure my team has better productivity in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I was on one of our other fireside chats for this RevEx Fest. I was talking with Nick Mehta from Gainsight about this.
Sure.
And really the kind of the crux of it was like the community, right? The community of discipline, of the discipline, right? So
Exactly.
in Gainsight's case, it's customer success leadership. In you guys' case, it's sales enablement. And we think about this very much as well, where, the craft of sales management is not super well defined, because people get battlefield promoted as an account executive or as SDR, and it's like, all right, cool, like go manage, and really understanding like what those important capabilities are that they should be good at, is a newly emergent thing. And of course, like, in our case, lots of those pieces have metrics and data associated with, not all of them,
Yep.
but really just defining like what it means to be a great sales manager, what it means to be a great sales enablement person, is like the first thing. And then of course, like then the solutions slot into it.
And then the other challenge that we have to some extent is that enablement is a bridge between product marketing, who does a lot of the content and some of the plays.
Yep.
And if it's a big company, typically a sales training organization, which is maybe inside of enablement or maybe a peer to enablement, and operations, which thinks about all those analytics we talked about earlier, and some of the other tools that they use. And so enablement, when we talk about maturing the discipline, we also have to mature how ops thinks about it, how training thinks about it, how product marketing thinks about it, as well as the leadership. So it's an interesting category to mature. It will get matured because it is the key lever. Like, if you think about, if you're a CRO and you just step all the way back, you're like, okay, what's my biggest expense? Well, it's clearly all my people.
Humans.
And if I could drive them to higher productivity through more consistent execution, it's a
all day
no-brainer.
long.
So
Yeah.
it is going to be a must-have category. The only question is, how quickly can we get it there where people understand how to use the tools and how to use the best practices around those tools? It's really both things.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Robert, this is absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We have another event coming up here. Angelica is going to come on and she's going to tell us about the next thing that's on deck next at RevEx Fest. Thank you very much for taking the time. This was super fun. I hope people were as illuminated as I was around how you guys at Hightspot think about this and kind of where the industry is going.
Great. Well, hey, thanks for having me. It was really fun.
Well, folks, that's a wrap. Thank you for sticking with us throughout the day, and we hope to see you tomorrow bright and early for 7 a.m. for well-oiled machines running RevOps at pre-public scale. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you then. Bye, everyone.